Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Wherever you may hail, I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus, where we bring you the most thought-provoking and informative current affairs analysis from around the world. Each episode, we invite top experts and analysts to share their insights on the most pressing issues of our time, from international relations and global economics to philosophy and science. No topic is off limits. Join us as we explore the complex and ever-changing landscape of the world, where we provide valuable perspectives on the events that shape our global community. Today, we are very pleased to be joined by Dr. Sean McFate, speaking about a book he recently wrote, The New Rules of War, and also the idea of durable disorder and how it relates to today's international climate. Sean is an author, strategist, and expert on international relations. He is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, Syracuse University's Maxwell School, and the National Defense University. He is an advisor to Oxford University's Center for Technology and Global Affairs. Sean is one of the world's leading experts on mercenaries. He is a regular consultant to the Pentagon, the CIA, and Hollywood. Sean, thank you for joining us on The Focus.
Thank you, John. It's great to be on your show.
Sean, for those who are unfamiliar with your work, especially the key points you raise about modern war, can you give our audience a brief snapshot of what you think are war's main drivers today?
Sure. Well, it might be easier to explain what it will not be. There's a saying that generals always fight the last war they won. And we see that today. We see this in Ukraine today, when NATO countries are, sending tanks and F-16s, and somehow the theory of victory is battlefield victory wins. And it's a very World War II style way of war. The last war, if we're candid, that at least the United States, where I'm from, won, which is 70 years ago. And what we're seeing now, of course, is that warfare has changed dramatically. We live in an information age, like a hyper-information age, and barring nuclear warfare, it will only continue to become more so information. And in an information age, information becomes more important than firepower when it comes to victory of war. Meanwhile, we are fighting sort of a Clausewitzian, conventional war, World War II style war of force on force, around sort of nationalism, when our enemies are using disinformation, especially against democracies and other, plausible deniability. There's all sorts of weapons of modern information warfare that seem to be, AWOL from general officers' toolkits when it comes to winning. Not all general officers, but, a lot of them, and also a lot of civilian, policymakers and so forth. So my mission is to sort of rail against this, what I call the Maginot mentality, and try to widen our perspective about what does warfare look like today? How do you win it? And if, especially how does a democracy do this? Because we can talk more about this later, but autocracies have a lot of advantages when it comes to weaponizing information that democracies simply cannot do. Or if they try to do, they will become autocracies in the process, like censorship. So I'm trying to figure out ways that, how do you win 21st century conflict? And how do we break the mentality, the sort of the Ludendorff syndrome, if you will, of just bullets down range is how you win wars, winning battles.
I find it really amazing, having read your work, that we are in this kind of World War II mentality. And, the thing that I always go back to is that in 2014, when the Russians captured Crimea, and they did so in a very spectacular, almost bloodless manner, you kind of thought that that may be the future of war. And of course, what you were saying at the time seemed to have borne this out. But
Yes,
of course, the Russians, they regressed, didn't they?
they
As soon
did.
as 2022 came along, they decided to go down the whole conventional warfare route. Why do you think that was so?
This is a remaining question. I mean, Putin, who has been so savvy since 1999 of waging these sort of secret wars globally and turning basically a hand that wasn't, was crap into like a rising superpower. And then he blows it on one bet, if you will. He goes back to 1941 blitzkrieg tactics, classically thinks it's all going to be over in 3 days, and defeated by irregular warfare, guerrilla warfare by the Ukrainians using Javelin anti-tank missiles.
Yep.
And the war is stalemated. But what's even more peculiar, John, is that somehow the Ukrainians regressed along the way. So they, in December of 2022, they got bogged down in eastern Ukraine and Solidar and Bakhmut, where both sides were fighting a neo-Stalingrad or a Verdun. I mean, it seems like we've learned nothing over 100 years, if you ask me. And this is the problem. It's like, why do we forget? This is the bigger problem. And I don't know why Putin decided to go full on blitzkrieg. It's a huge mystery. And I think also, at least I'll speak for the United States, is that, the Pentagon in Washington, where I live, is learning all the wrong lessons from Ukraine. It is doing selection and confirmation bias, where they look at the conventional war aspects like Bakhmut and like the tanks and but they're missing the overall modern aspects, such as the second best army in the field is a mercenary army, the Wagner Group. That's nothing conventional about mercenaries. How both sides use disinformation to con each other and con the world. How Russia has taken on the strategies and tactics of Al-Qaeda by deliberately targeting civilians to inflict terror. Nothing about that is conventional. So in this, if we're honest about it again, this war in Ukraine is not a conventional war. It's not the return to conventional war. And the conventional strategies and tactics that both sides have embraced have only failed.
And yet they don't seem to be morphing into anything obviously different, which is exactly what you've just said. So it's kind of like we're stuck in this almost strategic conundrum of where the past has revisited the future with better weapons.
Right.
And the people who are in their respective capitals, the military elites, are looking at this war and drawing all the wrong lessons, which means what exactly? Do you think that, the idea of future hybridized campaigns, as we saw the Russians conduct in 2014, is now the thing in the past, not going to be repeated in the foreseeable future? Because again, you look around the world and you see potentially the economic community of West Africa going up against Niger. Niger hosts Wagner. Now, if that ends up being another conventional force on force battle, we're just going to be seeing a kind of repeat, maybe a smaller scale version of conventional war in West Africa. No one's bringing the new kit to the party in the way that we were anticipating.
Yes. Well, let's return to Wagner Group's business model in Africa and elsewhere, because I think that they're doing some things which are not conventional. But the larger question of like, why do we fail to learn, whether it's Moscow or Kiev or Washington, the warriors and leaders of countries, they have a moral obligation to be competent, because when they get it wrong, people die, and we're seeing Russia do that right now. When it comes even to the United States, when it comes to 20 years of Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, we have a lot of lessons captured, but few lessons learned. So there's a larger question about why do we fail to learn? And what is it about professional warriors, at least in uniform, where they all want to fight some sort of Napoleonic style war, right?
Yeah.
There's an old saying in business that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And what that really means is that our strategic culture, and every country has a strategic culture, can eclipse its strategic IQ. And an example of this is like what the United States is doing right now in the Straits of Taiwan. They're practicing, a war against China, like it's the Battle of Midway, but with better technology, Ford-class carriers and F-35s, thinking that a battlefield win there can, stop great power competition. When we know for a fact that it can't. And you know why we know that? Because this is how the West won the Cold War. The West won the Cold War and avoided major combat operations in Germany in the Fulda Gap with the Soviets. And they did it through, disinformation, sort of covert operations, coercive diplomacy, better economic policy, and just a better way of life, attraction. And there's no reason to think that China maybe can't achieve that by 2049 too. But we are stuck in a World War II mentality. So is Putin. Now, so is Kyiv. And the problem is that around the world, people are imitating this while saying, well, if these big powers are fighting this way, that must be the way it is. And of course, Lockheed Martin and the other sort of bandits of the Beltway are, sort of pumping this on full force because to them it's Santa Claus wish list. But I think we have to stand back and look at what matters and what wins in warfare. Because if you look at, the West's track record for the last 70 years of war, if this is going to be provocative, but if there's one trend, it's this, is that big armies and high-tech technology does not matter for victory. The French lost against Luddites in Algeria and Indochina. The Brits in Cyprus and Palestine, the Soviets in Afghanistan, the US in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. At some point, we have to realize that warfare has fundamentally shifted since the World War II glory days, band of brothers fought by the greatest generation, into something else. But the problem is this: if a guy like Putin, who is very savvy to this, does a 180 and reverts back and seems to learn nothing from that, I don't know what that says about geopolitics of our day.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I don't either. I mean, I've been looking at how the wars developed, and it's just, look, my background is in defense acquisition. One of the touchstone things that I want to raise with you now is about the metrics of warfare and what the public understands about the metrics of warfare. Now, when you look at all the media reporting that's been going on with regard to the Ukraine war, it's almost as if personnel don't exist and it's all about weapons. We need to get long-range weapons. We need to get more drones in. We need to get more artillery shells in. And it's all about quantity and maximizing the quantity of the weaponry you put on the table. Now, with regard to the United States, they have invested, and you're absolutely right, they've got their military-industrial complex, the Lockheed Martins, the General Dynamics, and so on and so forth. They have invested so much in technology. As it started off during the Cold War, especially the 1980s, where all this new fangled stuff hit the headlines, and they were actually scaling up production on a massive level to outcompete the Soviets. We haven't really stepped back from that, at least in the Western model of force structure. So surely this gives America clear advantages militarily over countries like Russia and China, or not? What's your view?
It doesn't, because I'll tell you why. Is that, well, first of all, you're correct that the metrics that the US and others are using in places like Ukraine is looking at weapon systems and not people and will to fight. And I also believe that, the most important weapon we possess is the 6 inches between our ears. Because let's not forget that, the Vietnamese, the Iraqis, the Taliban, I mean, they didn't have superior weapon systems, yet they succeeded. They won against the United States. And I'm sticking to the United States because I know that better than Australia. And also here's the other question. Does battlefield victory matter anymore? Right? I mean, we all remember mission accomplished. President George W. Bush on an aircraft carrier in 2003 in April, thinking that the U.S. had clearly won the war in Iraq because by conventional war metrics we had. It's basically, did you kill or capture more enemy soldiers? Did you take more enemy land? Did you fly your flag over enemy capital? Check, check, check. Yes. That's how Napoleon won. It's how World War I and II, or World War II was won. But it didn't matter. Us destroying the Iraqi military was inconsequential for the strategic outcome of the Iraq War. So we have the wrong metrics. And if it wasn't superior combat systems that won, then what did win? And what, our adversaries have done is they've been very clever. They've done things like weaponizing time. They've taken a very Maoist strategy or a Sun Tzuian strategy. And I teach at a war college in the United States, and we don't really study those things. I mean, I try to, but we study Clausewitz, Jomini, big war theory. World War II is the paradigm, and we're now paradigm prisoners of this form of warfare. And this is all it is. It's a form of warfare. It's not the timeless and universal form of warfare that we make it out to be. And I don't think that wars can be won. I think, for example, Ukraine could have exploited fissures that are natural between private warfare of the Wagner Group and the conventional war of the Siloviki, which is the heads of the Russian, military state, the generals, the heads of the GRU, because there's we can talk about this, but warfare is always constantly changing. The nature of war never changes, but the character of warfare always changes. And I feel like the West and now Russia has been exposed for being stuck in the past. Yeah. And that makes them exploitable. And I think a clever adversary can play David to the Goliath of the United States or Russia or whomever. We need to upgrade our strategic IQ.
What does this actually say about the way the West is supporting and advising Kiev at the moment? Because, you're not I would like to think you're not the lone voice talking about this in the United States. There must be some of this message filtering up the chain somewhere in the Biden administration. So if people are starting to think, well, you know what, Russia is a giant with feet of clay, we could trip them up. Why aren't they doing it? Why aren't the Europeans? I mean, the Europeans, they're actually on the European continent. You would think that there'd be some key people in Brussels seeing that there are advantages, asymmetric advantages that the European armed forces collectively could put into the field to help the Ukrainians win. No one's doing it.
It's a great question, John. And I like to think that there are people, but they're not high enough in rank to speak truth to power, as they say. I think also some of it is the problem of culture eclipsing strategic IQ, that US and NATO are like, oh, we don't fight this way. This is not honorable. And for that, I ask this question: is it somehow better to lose honorably than to win dishonorably? And I say never. And let's not forget that the US and the West and others, probably including Australia, used to fight this way a little bit during the Cold War. And lastly, I think that there is that the US and the West are doing some of this, but it's of such inconsequence that we can't tell, right? So we have to turn the volume up or change the way we're doing it, or something there is not as effective as it ought to be. So what I advocate for is a lot more sneakiness. We need to be sneaky. I think war is getting sneaky for a variety of reasons. We need to be sneaky. And I think there's ways we can be sneaky without tempting a nuclear war. In fact, I think it's a lot better to be sneaky, because the Cold War was fought in a sneaky way. Because the Cold War was fought this way. It's everybody knew that the nature of war is to escalate. Clausewitz tells us that. Everybody tells us this. And the question is, how do you compete with the Soviet Union without having a Cuban Missile Crisis, without having, it going from a platoon shooting at each other to global nuclear warfare in 1 hour? And the way that countries did it during the Cold War is, imagine a table. Above the table, we had coercive diplomacy, we had, threats, we had strong militaries, but we made very clear that they did not occupy the same grid square to avoid a shooting match that could escalate. But beneath the table, we were kicking each other all the time through political warfare, through clandestine and covert operations, through all sorts of means and ways. And that's what the future is going to be when we have a nuclear China, a nuclear Russia, a nuclear NATO. We're going to have to, but we've forgotten this in the last 30 years. For some reason, the United States has forgotten this. And this is a question of why do we forget?
See, here in Australia, we've been putting so much emphasis recently on this new AUKUS compact between ourselves here in Australia, the British and the Americans. Again, it seems to be couched in very conventional warfare terms, as though we're preparing for a rerun of the Battle of Midway using submarines, for instance, but in a very conventional way, even though submarines can be unconventional,
very much so, yeah,
delivery systems, right? So we're using it as we used to do it in World War II. And my problem with that is that from a national security perspective, we're now starting to reinvent this traditional strategic culture that should be long past us. And I think the monies aren't going to be well spent as a consequence, and nor will the strategic thinking.
I agree. This is, again, what I call the Maginot mentality. So let's think about the French, right? So again, the saying that generals always fight the last war they won. If you go back to 1919, the Treaty of Versailles, the French, Clemenceau and the High Command of France thought the next world war against the Germans would look just like the one they won, which was, trench warfare. So they put all their money into the Maginot Line, one of the greatest fortification systems in history. And if you visit it today, it's still amazing. I mean, it really is amazing. But of course, as we all know, it was already obsolete by 1940. The Germans changed their way of warfare. They changed a lot more in their technology. They changed how they used it, how they fought, how they organized, how they resupplied, how they did acquisitions, everything, the culture. And they easily outflanked the Maginot Line. And what the Germans couldn't achieve in 4 bloody years of World War I, they achieved in 46 days in World War II. And I fear that this is the trend of Western strategic thought. And we see it in acquisitions, we see it everywhere. And then once you have these super expensive, exquisite acquisitions like F-35s and submarines, you have means-driven strategy. Your strategy now is well, here's what we have to achieve, but we have to use, these are the only things we have on hand, these submarines. So how do we use a submarine to win a landlocked battle, right? I mean, that's, this is the problem, the trap that we get into. So again, it's why I say the most important weapon is the 6 inches between our ears.
Sean, you've always been very vocal about the return of mercenary forces to the modern battlefield. Recently on my LinkedIn network, I got into a stoush regarding a post on the use of private military companies. Some within my network believe that PMCs are excellent in being able to take the logistical, technical, and supply burdens off military forces. Their argument being that it relieved those in uniform to focus on fighting rather than support tasks. I questioned whether PMCs were actually a cheaper alternative to in-house supply and support, considering some noted rorting scandals and the costs of hiring PMCs, which is both expensive and has its own complexities, political, legal, financial, not to mention moral and ethical. how do you see the embedded nature of private military companies in Western armed forces today? Is it a help or a hindrance in modern force structure development?
What a great question, John. So as you know, I've been banging the drum about mercenaries for at least 15 years. And
Yep.
it seems funny that the world has finally sort of woken up to mercenaries after Wagner marched on Moscow this past year. And so people are like, what, mercenaries exist? And let's not forget the last two to try that were Hitler and Napoleon. So, and the reason I I fell into this field is because I was one a long time ago. I was a private military contractor / mercenary. I saw things that shocked me. I wanted to think deeply about it, and I ended up getting out. And I did something I don't think many of those people do, and I do not recommend it. I went to graduate school. Which you should never go to when you're trying to sort out your life problems, So I guess the first thing I think in principle, well, let's leave the whole question of what's the difference between a mercenary and a private military company or a PMC. Let's put that aside. Let's bracket that for a second. I personally don't have any problem with companies that do the non-lethal things for military support, sort of combat service and combat service support, doing admin logistics. This does not include, obviously, things like trigger pulling. It doesn't include going into, doing a covert operation into a non-permissive environment. It doesn't include training and equipping forces, because training and equipping forces is usually done by special forces, and it's a paramilitary / military function. It's not something a private company does or should do. Only, if a private company does do it, they're all ex-military guys and gals. But I think in terms of logistics and resupply and all that, that's, fixing trucks and cooking food, that's fantastic. Now, do we have good systems in place to mitigate fraud, waste, and abuse? Of course we don't. Iraq, Afghanistan, the U.S. experience, my goodness. The nation building we could have done at home. It is ridiculous. And the federal acquisition regulation, which is what governs the U.S., how it does acquisitions, it's like 3 phone books thick for. That's a call out to our older listeners, a phone book. But it is, and it's not just corruption within the military sphere. There's corruption within all government spheres of acquisition. Also development, the aid organizations that countries have too. Goodness knows where that all disappears to. So in principle, I have no objection to it. In practice, yes, there are lots of problems, and I don't know how to get around that. That you need a Harry Potter wand in U.S. Congress to fix that.
Maybe the aliens will come and solve this issue for us.
If we're lucky.
Okay, so what about the Russian example of the use of mercenary forces? We recently saw how the Wagner Group staged a short mutiny against the Russian military leadership. How did you see this development? And when mercenary groups are coupled to charismatic leadership, do they not pose threats to their customers?
Of course they do. This is the oldest problem in private warfare. Look, mercenaries are the second oldest profession for a reason. Is you cannot regulate them. And the reason you cannot regulate them is contract enforcement. And what we saw, the Prigozhin-Wagner march in Moscow was not a mutiny. It was not a coup d'etat. It was not a black flag operation. It was a renegotiation. This is classically how mercenaries renegotiate contracts, because there's no rule, there's no court you can go to. So this has led to, for eons, Machiavelli talks about this in The Prince in 1512, is that mercenaries and their masters rip each other off all the time. Not just mercenaries to masters, but masters to mercenaries. In the Middle Ages, popes would hire mercenary armies to kill and do unholy things, like the massacre of Béziers in 1209 in France, where it's the famous line where, kill them all, God will know his own. It's, by the Pope's lips, or allegedly. And, this is, and then they would be deadbeats. Popes wouldn't pay the mercenaries. And so this is the problem of loyalty. National armies, sometime magically between 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, and the 1850s in Europe, when mercenaries were fully outlawed in all forms, nation states somehow monopolized the market for force, replaced them with national standing armies that were ideologically loyal to an ideology called nationalism. And they outlawed mercenaries. And that's actually where the stigma of mercenaries comes from today. Because before then, everybody hired, you talk about mercenaries in the Old Testament 7 times, never with any stigma. Everybody hired mercenaries throughout history. It was just like hiring a contractor to fix your kitchen. It was seen as a bloody yet honorable trade. In fact, in the Middle Ages, they were called condottieri, contractors, like they're called today. The euphemism for mercenary is military contractor. And you work at a private military company today. In the Middle Ages, you work for a free company. It's funny how these euphemisms stuck around. It's not like Euban Barlow and from Executive Outcomes was reading Middle Ages history. It's funny how these things have come out. But the classic problem of mercenary warfare was many, but the biggest one is contract enforcement and what happens when one party wants to renegotiate by treachery. And this has always plagued mercenary warfare. And it should be a signal to the rest of us, because even if wily Putin can control his mercenaries, everybody else should think 3 times before they hire them.
Oh, absolutely. Just as an aside, though, one of my forebears, Leonardo Bruni, who was a great Florentine humanist and Chancellor of Florence in the early 1400s, wrote a book, De Militia, in 1420, extolling the virtues of coupling the idea of chivalry to the Greco-Roman ideals of military service. Because, of course, back in those days, the plague of mercenary captains just scouring the Italian peninsula was insane. And they were looking for active alternatives to that system. Are we in danger, though, Sean, of chasing our tails on this issue, with the pendulum swinging in favor of mercenaries in one epoch before being actively resisted in another?
It's an interesting question. Well, first of all, on your quote of Bruni, I mean, it's amazing how Machiavelli gets all the credit for this, but I think that if you look at history, private warfare has been a main facet of warfare for all time. The Romans relied heavily on private warfare. I mean, they only had 26, 27 legions, and each legion only had about 6,000 max legionnaires. You don't control a huge empire with just 26 legions. They used proxy, they used also economic warfare, and they used a lot of things. The Middle Ages used mercenaries a great deal. Most of history is private warfare, but the world that we grew up in, 6th grade or first form or whatever, reading about is that states have been timeless and universal, and that's always the way it has been. Only conventional war, which is the War of Westphalia of states, that's always been universal when it has not been. And so what we're seeing around the world is that the pendulum is going back to normal, where warfare has become commodified once again. And it looks shocking and bewildering to us because it's so alien to us, even though historically it's the norm. It's only the last 200 years have been the anomaly. And so we're seeing it come back in different places at different times in the world. It's creating a lot of confusion about its future. Are we going to be heading to an era, to a time like 20 years from now where ExxonMobil and Elon Musk get their own militaries?
Right.
Or is this Wagner going to dissipate and it'll become kind of a weird thing of the past? I mean, I believe it's going to be more the former than the latter, but it's, anybody's guess, really.
Now, one of the key issues about mercenary forces is this notion of plausible deniability. I mean, a state can direct a mercenary force into an area of conflict and then sit back and say, hey, it's not on my watch, I didn't do anything, so there's no tracing back to a government order. Now, Putin, interestingly, in the aftermath of the Wagner imbroglio, decided to say Wagner is Russia. So he kind of blew the cover of Wagner, didn't he?
Well, he blew that cover in July of 2022 when let's talk about the Wagner Group. Let's go into some detail about them. The Wagner Group was a weapon of choice for Russia between 2014 and 2022 because of its plausible deniability. Mercenaries are inherently plausibly deniable because you can easily disavow them. And you can hire them to do things they don't even know who hired them. So, for example, in 2021, Colombian mercenaries assassinated the president of Haiti. Now, we caught the mercenaries, but even they don't know who hired them, right, through all the cutouts. So it means somebody got away with assassinating a head of state. And success is always going to be replicated somewhere down the line. Other people watch this, and we think it's a drug cartel, but this will just embolden other cartels. Russia has been doing this for a long time now, well, for several years now. They can send the Wagner Group, like special forces, into a place like Syria or Libya, and if things go sideways, they can disavow it and say, oh, they're just war tourists. And even though we all know that they work for Russia, are we really going to engage in some sort of international debacle that could lead to a World War III scenario? No, we walk away. To give you a great example of this is February 7-8 in 2018 in eastern Syria. About 300 to 400 Wagner Group guys ran into, almost by accident, kind of by accident, American Special Operations Forces in eastern Syria at Kasham. And there was a battle that lasted 4 hours between Wagner Group and American Special Operations Forces. The US killed more Russians that night, over 200, than any night during the Cold War. But the reason it didn't go to World War III is because both Moscow and Washington invoked the plausible deniability of mercenaries. Said nothing to see here. But if those were Russian soldiers, Putin couldn't easily walk away from it. Yeah. So you can see how plausible deniability, in an information age especially, plausible deniability becomes a real weapon of cunningness, of craftiness that can be wielded and can be a lot more effective than brute force. I mean, that's how Russia took their Crimea in 2014. They created a ghost occupation of special forces, Spetsnaz, Wagner Group mercenaries, little green men, these astroturfed fake militias, and lots of propaganda from the Internet Research Agency. They created a fog of war when the West was still scratching its head about what were the facts on the ground in eastern Ukraine. The Crimea was a fait accompli. And only then did Putin come out and say, look, it was us all along, ha, ha, ha. And so that was the initial game plan in some ways for Ukraine in 2022. It wasn't secret, but they used mercenaries because, again, nobody cares about dead mercenaries. They do care about dead Russian soldiers. They also don't care about conscripts from the outer periphery of Russia. They care about conscripts from Moscow and St. Petersburg. But when that failed, Putin had to find bodies, and he turned to Prigozhin and said, I need you to make Wagner Group, which is like 10,000 mercenaries, into like 50. And Prigozhin said, well, for me to do that, I got to go public now, boss. And I've got to empty out jails. And so he did all that. And that's when Prigozhin in July of 2022 said, I do own the Wagner Group. We all knew it, but he said it. And that's when they started to empty out, jails to act as cannon fodder in eastern Ukraine in like Bakhmut and Soledar. So the proverbial cat is out of the bag.
Yeah. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from the US, we're speaking with author and expert in international relations and mercenary forces, Dr. Sean McFate. Sean, as we wrap up this podcast, unfortunately, I've got like a litany of questions that will run into another 2 hours, but I think we need to sort out a time in the future where we can actually address some of these things because it's a fascinating conversation. But in your idea of durable disorder, what happens to the utility of nuclear deterrence? For instance, if Pakistan, an established nuclear power, fails and its nuclear capabilities cannot be secured by US or Indian forces and ends up in the hands of Taliban or ISIS-like groups, durable disorder might have a bit of an end of times ring to it. I mean, such groups are apocalyptic and would not be deterred by nuclear weapons of the Security Council 5. So considering their acts of violence are often perpetrated against civilian targets, if they had access to WMDs, they would probably use them, right?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, so you have examples of the Ali Khan network in Pakistan about 20 years ago, sort of selling Pakistan's nuclear secrets to high bidders like North Korea and others. And certainly nobody wants to see the loss of nuclear weapons. I do know that the control measures around nukes, at least in a country like the United States, they have like a remote control on-off switch. So if the nuclear warheads or whatever somehow get stolen, the US presses a switch, and in theory, it renders the nuclear weapon inert. I suppose somebody could, take it apart and use the parts for another nuclear weapon. I don't think that's easy. I'm not a nuclear scientist. Now, does Russia and Pakistan have that? I don't know. And certainly for tactical nukes, these are nukes you can shoot out of artillery. I don't think that's the case. And that, I think, is a bigger threat, because you can take tactical nukes, put them into a truck, drive them into someplace, a city, and explode them, and there's enough yield to, make it count, shall we say. But I do think, my interest in what I call durable disorder came from my work as a private military contractor in Africa, because many people look at sub-Saharan Africa, which is where the conflict markets are, which is why I was there. It's why Wagner is there. It's sort of like the Middle Ages. There actually is governance on the ground. It's local. It's highly imperfect. It's very feudal. Human rights violations occur all the time, just like they're occurring all the time in Ukraine today. But there is governance. So just because there's not a strong nation state presence doesn't mean that there's no governance. And if you look at them like a map of Africa or much of the world, the Middle East, parts of South Asia, the geographic lines that denote states really don't reflect where the boundaries of power begin and end in those regions. It's quite a mosaic of things. And our job is to understand what that mosaic truly looks like on the ground, and how do we frankly push and pull that mosaic for our own interests. And that durable, so it's sort of like the Middle Ages. We think of the Middle Ages in Europe as like the Dark Ages, as the Knights of Ni, and it's crazy, it's dark, but in truth it wasn't. It's not like the sky was falling. Invest in more sky for lack of a strong nation state system. There were a lot of global governance, but it was messy. You had fractured sovereignty and overlapping sovereignties. That is what we're seeing in much of the world today. But again, we have this very state-centric Westphalian conventional war model of formal institutions using formal ways of modalities of war to fight. When we're in a post, Westphalian era, we're in a post state-centric era, we're in a post everything era, and we need to get smart. And it doesn't mean that everybody is. I mean, Australia is not, the US is not, West Europe is not, but most of the world kind of is. I mean, Latin America is, with narco states and stuff. We need to recalibrate how we embrace the world and how we are frankly going to exercise power and restraint to achieve our national interests, and not go back to some 1940s glory year model.
All right. Final question for this episode with you. Now, it's all about China. And here in Australia, we have been very concerned about the might of China. We are America's unsinkable aircraft carrier in the South Pacific. To the north of us, we have Japan, and then a little bit to the west of Japan, we have South Korea. The three of our states are extraordinarily concerned with what's happening in terms of Chinese military maneuvers in the South China Sea, and especially with regard to military exercises close to the island of Taiwan. Now, if one's a betting person and one were to see all the sort of bravado that the Chinese leader Xi has put forward in terms of capturing Taiwan, it does speak to a notion of conventional war. So how do you think this plays out? Because up until now, the Chinese have played this salami slicing, very clever, tactically positioning, non-lethal influence operations, especially here in Australia, using both corrupt politicians as their entrance point, or perhaps by using the Confucian centers at universities. They have got a lot of influence over us. And yet, here we are planning World War II redux. What are your thoughts on that?
This reminds me of how Moscow and Kiev fell into a conventional war with each other, even though they didn't have to do it. And they're both bleeding each other dry. They've both, frankly, Putin's badass talk has come down quite a few notches. And they're both in trouble. Let's face it. And I think that China and our Quad has the same challenges. About a couple of weeks ago, I was in Hawaii at U.S. Pacific Command, which is the military command that is in charge of this military for the U.S. sort of controls and commands this area. And they are strictly in the World War II paradigm. Their focus is putting Chinese steel at the bottom of the South China Sea only, not only, but mostly. And it dominates their strategic thinking. And this is a huge problem. And the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, are the same. And this gets back to this question of why do professional militaries all want to fight this Napoleonic warfare? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. And even that China doesn't even have a tradition of this. I mean, they won their war against the nationalists using Maoist guerrilla warfare and protracted war. So it's a bizarre amnesia for which they have no excuse. Now, that said, their military, their foreign affairs office is clever. They are doing things, we focus on that. Well, the U.S. focuses on the military as an act of mirror imaging, because the military for us is the lion's share of our budget. We spend more on our military than Saudi Arabia's GDP. It's really crazy. And so we're invested in this way of war mentally. And I think, but China really isn't. They're doing things like economic warfare through Belt Road Initiative in Africa and across Asia. They're doing the three warfare strategy, which you talked about, the war of influence. They use lawfare. They can be quite clever. They're having a lot of problems right now with their economy and some other issues that we can talk about. But, they honestly, they can, in my opinion, they cannot occupy Taiwan until earliest 2027. They don't have the amphibious ships needed to even do it. So why are we all treating it like they're going to do it next year? Do they even need to do it at all? They have until 2049 to absorb it culturally and economically. I think they can probably do that if they really want to. And I think if we really want to weaken China, I have some interesting ideas for another episode using what I call sneaky war to do that. The idea is not to take over Beijing and fly a flag there. The idea is simply to make them retreat a little bit and stop threatening their neighbors. And we can do it by being more David than Goliath. And it's going to raise some interesting questions about what are we prepared to do? But I think those are questions that need to be surfaced, that people should think about. And are they somehow less risky than nuclear war over the Straits of Taiwan? I don't think so.
Well, Sean, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there for now. But I've got you on a promise, sneaky war, the next episode that we're going to do.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us today and for sharing your insights on the focus, Sean.
Thank you, John. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. And to our audience, thanks for tuning into the Focus podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media. You can find the Focus on Facebook, referenced on the John Bruni and Sage International LinkedIn pages, and on Twitter or on the Sage International website, sageinternational.com.au, by clicking the media drop-down menu and hitting podcasts. And please leave us your comments on inquiries@sageinternational.com.au. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and or leave us a review on your favorite platform. My thanks to our stalwart production team of Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart, and to the team at the Ozcast Network. Join us again next time as we continue to delve into the most pressing current affairs issues of our time. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged. I'm John Bruni, and from Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.